This morning I was reading an article on a dubious website. I say dubious because not that the website itself is really that dubious, but that the commenters, the readers are. And there's a lot of negativity against the Jews on among the commenters on this website, but sometimes, you should read the musings of your enemy so that you will know what your enemy is up to. And this particular article has a lot of truth in it. And it is biblical. And it is prophetic. The title is called How Europe Built Its Own Funeral Pyre and Then Leapt In. Those of you who don't know what a pyre is, that was the old English word for fire. And this is on Zero Hedge. Apparently this is written by Tyler Durden. Before I get started, I want to remind everyone there is a reason why I am wearing this and the yellow star. It is in honor of all the Jews who suffered persecution at the hands of Christians, from Constantine to the Holocaust. The Christians who pillaged, raped, murdered, put the Jews on stakes and burned them with fire. In the name of Jesus. Jesus. In the name of their false god, Jesus. And may those Jews and those followers of Yeshua receive redemption and justice for the crimes committed against them by these children of Cain. So, what Tyler Durden is implying here is Europe built their own funeral fire, their own cremation fire, and then jumped in. That would be right. That would be correct. Is this biblical? We'll read on, and we will see that this becomes more and more like a prophecy in Daniel. It says authored by Robert Mary via the Strategic Culture Foundation. Oh, I see. Interesting. So Tyler Durden did not write this article. So I want to give credit where credit is due here. And, all right. So I'm going to the strategicculture.org news website, and I'm going to read from there. The single most significant issue of our time is not North Korea's drive to develop long-range nuclear missiles. It is not the threat posed to Europe by Russian land power or the threat posed to American Asian dominance by the Chinese sea power. It is not Iran's growing Middle Eastern influence, nor the ongoing investigation into Russian meddling in the U.S. election and possible collusion by the Trump campaign. No, the defining issue of our day is mass migration into nations of Western heritage. This growing inflow threatens to remake those nations and overwhelm their cultural identity. This is the issue that played the largest role in getting Donald Trump elected. It drove Britain's Brexit vote. It is roiling the European continent, mounting tensions inside the EU, and driving a wedge between the elites of those nations and their general population. Now, you see, folks, it is starting to look biblical, isn't it? I will stop right there for a second and go to Daniel. Let's see. Come on. Let's see if it's in Daniel 10. Daniel 7, I mean. It might be in Daniel. Yeah, I think it's in Daniel 2. Daniel, yeah. Yes, it is. We all should know by now that the kingdom of iron in Daniel 2 is Europe. After all, it was the Greeks who started the Bronze Age. Go do your Google search, look in your encyclopedia, whatever you have to do, you'll find out it was the Greeks who started the Bronze Age in Central Europe. That started the Iron Age. Therefore, sometimes, it does not take a whole lot of thinking to put, one and one together to make two. Verse 40, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, as the iron that breaks all these, it shall break into pieces and bruise. And whereas you saw the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. What did we just read on this particular article? Europe has become divided, the elites versus the general population. Why? Why is this happening? Let's read more of Daniel 2, and we will find out. Now, I must remind everyone that the revealing of Daniel's dream is politically incorrect. The Europeans are, how do I put this? They have been brainwashed to the point where they find such sayings or such truth that is written in Daniel 2 as offensive. And therefore their eyes are completely covered and they will not listen to the truth. Yes, they were divided, but there shall be in it the strength of iron. They still maintain their strength. For as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Well, this is exactly what we see in the kingdoms of Europe. Yes, they are not democracies. They are not republics. They are mainly constitutional monarchies. And even the ones who are not constitutional monarchies still have a king who has no power. Partly strong and partly broken. Verse 43, and whereas you saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. And that is the portion that I'm pointing out to you that is politically incorrect. That the truth would be found offensive in Europe because they have been brainwashed to believe that Babylonism, the mixing of the races, is good. They have embraced Babylonism because they are Babylon in spirit, figuratively speaking. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but guess what? They shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Now, here is where the prophecy gets very, very interesting, because the untold words in verse 44 are very telling. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In the days of these kings. What do you mean in the days of these kings? In the beginning of their days? Well, obviously not. Because if you would read, you read that it starts off with iron. So it's not in the beginning of those days. Is it in the middle of those days? Apparently not. Because once again, the implication is here, it is in the end portion of those kingdoms. Wow. How can I prove that? Well, it's easy. It's easier than saying 1 + 1 = 2. If we would read on, we would realize that it is in the end of those days of those kingdoms. Therefore, it is during the time that the iron is mixed with miry clay at the end. I'll explain. And in the days of these kings shall the Elohim of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And that the kingdom, which is in Jerusalem, shall not be left to other people anymore. And folks, you must remember that the Vatican is still in control of the real Mount Zion. I will continue. But it shall break into pieces and consume all these kingdoms. Oh, you see, it is at the end of those kingdoms. And it is when the kingdom is divided, because iron does not mix with miry clay. You see, as I said, you have to read the whole thing to understand the unspoken words here. You also have to understand this is translated from Hebrew to some other languages to English, or maybe from Hebrew to English. But my point is here that the implication is that the time that the iron mixed with miry clay is at the very end of those kingdoms when they are about to be destroyed. Okay? They shall be divided. We just read here in this article, strategicculture.org news, on this article, how Europe built its own funeral fire and then leapt in, that the the immigration issue, the Babylonian style governments that are in Europe have caused great division. I will continue reading this, and of course, it has divided the elites from the general population. I will read that part and continue. It is roiling the European continent, mounting tensions inside the EU, driving a wedge between the elites and those nations of those nations and their general population. Now, you know what that leads to. It always leads to, what is the, let them eat cake? Remember that? Those of you who don't know that term, you should do your due diligence and study history. Okay, indeed, the central battlefront in the immigration wars is Europe, which accepted a trickle of immigrants in the immediate post-war era due to labor shortages. But over the years, the trickle became a stream, then a growing river, and finally a torrent, to the extent that ethnic Britons are now a minority in their own capital city. Refugee flows into Germany went from 48,589 in 2010 to 1.5 million in 2015. And Italy, a key entry point, received at one point an average of 6,500 new arrivals per day. Throughout all this, the European elites celebrated the change and imposed a kind of thought enforcement regime against those who raised questions. The in-migration was initially hailed as an economic boon, then as a necessary corrective to an aging population, then as a means of spicing up society through diversity, and finally as a fait accompli, an unstoppable wave wrought by the world's gathering globalization. Besides, argued the elites, the new arrivals would all become assimilated into European culture eventually, so what's the problem? Meanwhile, public opinion surveys over decades showed that large majorities of Europeans harbored powerful misgivings about these changes. As British journalist and author Douglas Murray writes, promised throughout their lifetimes that the changes were temporary, that the changes were not real, or that the changes did not signify anything, Europeans discovered that in the lifespan of people now alive, they would become minorities in their own countries. Murray, associate editor of The Spectator in London, is the author of a compact volume exploring this phenomenon. It is called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam, and it was published 6 months ago by Bloomsbury. The tone is measured but unflinching. The picture he paints of the European future is bleak. So what we're seeing here, folks, we are seeing the demise of Europe on the horizon. This is not something that we can't see now because it's too early. No, we see it. The demise of Europe is on the horizon, something we can see. A key point of the book, reinforced through anecdote and abundant documentation, is that Muslim immigrants have not assimilated into their European host countries to any meaningful extent. Remember what we just read in Daniel 2. Iron does not mix with miry clay, and they shall not cleave to one another. Which means the miry clay was brought into the kingdom of iron, but they did not assimilate. This is first grade reading material here, folks, in Daniel 2. All you have to do is connect the dots between the prophecy and what is happening today. It's not hard to do. Indeed, there's a growing feeling among many of the new arrivals that these aren't host countries at all, but merely lands ripe for Islam's inexorable expansion. An 18-year-old Syrian refugee to Germany, Aras Bako, writing in Der Freitag and Huffington Post Deutschland, reflected this attitude when he said German migrants were fed up with angry Germans described as unemployed racists who insult and agitate. He added, "We refugees do not want to live in the same country with you. You can, and I think you should, leave Germany. Germany does not fit you. Why do you live here? Go look for it." So the immigrants are telling the Germans to get out. Consider also the significance of this fact. By 2015, more British Muslims were fighting for ISIS than for the British Armed Forces. There was nothing hidden about the resolve of many European Muslims to retain their own culture while overwhelming the European one at a rally in Cologne in 2008. Then Turkish Prime Minister, later President Erdogan, told a crowd of 20,000 Turks living in Germany, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands that assimilation in Europe would constitute a crime against humanity. He added, "I understand very well that you are against assimilation. One cannot expect you to assimilate." Yet he admonished the 5 million Turks living in Europe to pursue political influence through democratic means in order to wield a constitutional element in transforming the continent. Reading Murray's book, one gets an understanding of why he characterizes Europe's demise as strange. Notice the word demise again. You see, the continent's embrace of its own cultural death is indeed historically aberrational. And I were to say, if it's an aberration, something that doesn't normally happen, and if this aberration is prophesied in Daniel 2, then what we are about to witness is the choosing of Jerusalem once again to set the kingdom of Jehovah in. Now, hopefully I'll remember to go to Zechariah 1 and point this out, but I want to continue this because the next portion has a lot to do with why I am wearing this today. Okay? The continent's embrace of its own cultural death is indeed historically aberrational. Civilizations normally fight for the preservation of their cultures, unite to expel invaders, revere their identities, and the fundamental elements of their own heritage. That's absolutely 100% true, folks. But the West today is engaged in extensive, progressive extravagance of civilizational abnegation. Murray calls this the tyranny of guilt and identifies it as a pathology. There's a reason why this is happening, folks. And I'll explain in just a second. And maybe he'll explain as well. The concept of historical guilt, he writes, means that hereditary stains of guilt can be passed down through generations, much as Europeans themselves for generations held the Jews responsible for the killing of Christ. Eventually, this was seen as repugnant, and the man at the Vatican himself in 1965 formally lifted the historical burden. But now the concept is back in a suicidal Europe, where people apply it to themselves. This is indeed strange in historical terms. Murray explains that the motivation of those who engage in such flights of moral dungeon, thus, rather than being people responsible for themselves and answerable to those they know, they become the self-appointed representatives of the living and the dead, the bearers of a terrible history as well as a potential redeemers of mankind. From being a nobody, one becomes a somebody. Thus we have the West singled out, even by Westerners, as a particular brutish, harsh, exploitative, and evil civilization in a historical sea of relatively enlightened, restrained, and benign neighbors. But of course, this has no basis in history. Consider the Ottomans, who built a potent, expansive empire through policies and programs with greater brutality and harshness than the West ever displayed. I would disagree with that statement. This man is saying that the Muslims were worse than the Christians. That's not true. You see, the Christians know they're guilty. of committing the most brutal, heinous crimes against the Jews and against anyone who did not agree with their singular doctrinal approach. And as a result, they start feeling like, in some ways, they start feeling like they, how do I put this, are unredeemable, that the wickedness is in their genes. And so, by trying to overcompensate, they make the matter worse. And then they turn around and do the same things, the false accusation part of it, to anyone who disagrees with them, calling them racist, bigot, homophobe, whatever they want to do. And they completely miss the mark. Proving that apparently the wickedness is in their genes. Let's see. I will continue to read this. They talk about the Ottomans here. In the Balkans, they ripped young boys from the arms of their parents in order to indoctrinate them in Islam. That's what the Christians did too to the Jews. And employ them as elite warriors charged with keeping down their own people. And you think that the Christians did not do that also? They discriminated against non-Muslims with burdensome taxes or death for those who refused to pay. The Christians did worse. They burned them at the stake, extracted gold from their teeth. They employed all the tools of dominance in their drive to conquest or to conquer vast territories, including Europe, thwarted on 2 occasions outside the gates of Vienna, where Europe considered itself a civilization worth saving. Yet nobody suggests that modern Turks are responsible for any crimes or abuses of the Ottoman era, or that Turkey is an illegitimate nation that deserves to be overrun by outsiders. Certainly, there is no movement among Turks themselves to foster any such feelings or sentiments of guilt or atonement. Nor does anyone suggest that today's China or the Chinese should hang their heads in shame at the 40 million or so people killed by direct action and brutal policies of the Chinese leadership after Mao Zedong's communist takeover. Indeed, the Chinese today consider themselves victims of outside forces of the past and give hardly a thought to the profound victimization perpetuated by their former leaders. The Aztecs of Mexico killed people and ate their flesh in rituals of religious sacrifice, yet nobody believes modern-day Mexicans lose legitimacy as a people because of it. But in the West, self-elevation through cultural self-abnegation rolls on. It comes at the cost of a decline in Western self-consciousness. Europe, writes Murray, lost faith in its beliefs, traditions, and legitimacy, abandoning their Christian religion with studied conviction. Writes Murray, Europeans replaced it with the idea of progress, a secular concept that requires, as British intellectuals John Gray had noted, every bit as much of faith as any religion. Murray, with Gray, rejects the notion that mankind is on a trajectory of constant improvement as exemplified by Western liberalism, but that powerful concept militates against any sense of cultural self-preservation among many Europeans and Americans. Now, the Europeans are going to show their true colors once again, because at the very heart of Europe was the hatred of the Jews and the followers of Yeshua. And they didn't want to really fight against the Ottoman Turks. What they wanted to do was kill the Jews. There was a saying, I believe it was during the First Crusade, why should we go to kill the Ottomans in Eastern Europe, over in Constantinople, when we can kill the enemy right here where we are, namely the Jews. And that's what they did. And it's because of this that the Europeans are under such delusion. They know that their forefathers committed grievous sin against the holy people. They feel a sort of guilt for it. But even today, knowing what is written in the scripture, knowing that Jerusalem is to be reappointed, rechosen, they will, once again, for one more crusade. Don't forget, the Crusades were initially driven by Muslim invasion, but it always seemed to end with Europeans' defeat, almost always, as the Europeans sought to kill their enemy within their own, when I say Europeans, I mean Western Europeans, within their own borders, namely the Jews. It always ended up, they went after the Jews over and over and over again. And World War II wasn't really that much different, except the Nazis were actually in league with the Ottomans. And so, in the last days, the Europeans, knowing the scripture, knowing that the kingdom is going to be in Jerusalem, knowing what is written in Daniel 2, will come against Israel's Messiah in Jerusalem and will be defeated again. Because there is one thing that the Europeans just can't seem to get out of their genetic structure, and that is their hatred for the Jew. This is a long article, and I would urge everyone to read it. I will post a link on this article on my YouTube channel. But what I want to do is I think it's in Zechariah 1. Yes, it's both in Zechariah 1 and Zechariah 2. So Zechariah 1:17 is where it's written. And this is in the days of King Darius. And remember, we talked about how it seems like what's happening today is much like the days of King Darius. Okay? So this is Zechariah's call for repentance. And if we scroll down here to verse 12, the angel of Jehovah answered and said, this is after Zechariah's prayer, O Jehovah of hosts, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem, against which you have indignation these 70 years? Jehovah answered the angel and talked with me with good words and comfortable words. So the angel that communed with me said unto me, cry you out and say, thus saith Jehovah of hosts, I am jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with a great jealousy, and I am sorely displeased with the heathen that are at ease, because I was only a little displeased with Jerusalem. But they, the heathen, afflicted Jerusalem and Israel far worse than was acceptable. It says they helped forward the affliction. They were not supposed to do that. Therefore, thus saith Jehovah, I am returned to Jerusalem with mercies. Okay, so this was about the days of Darius concerning the king of Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem. The 70 years. All right? And one should read, as I said before, one should read Daniel 9 and the same outcome after the 77s of Daniel 9 it'll be the same outcome. I'm going to go to the Zechariah 2, and I'm not going to leave any stone unturned here. Wait a minute. Let's see. Zechariah 2 and verse 12. Okay, so let's look at and see what the Zechariah 2, how it defines Jehovah's returning to Jerusalem. I'll start in verse 1. I lifted up my eyes again and looked, behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, where are you going? And he said unto me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth and what is the length thereof. Wait a minute. John was told to do that. Revelation 11, read it. John was told to do that. To measure Jerusalem and to see what the breadth and what the length is. Let's go there. All right? Let me show you some. I believe it's Revelation 11. Okay. Verse 1. And I was given a reed like unto a rod, and an angel stood and said, rise and measure the temple and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court that is without the temple, leave out and measure it not, for it is given to the Gentiles. In the holy city shall they tread under foot for 42 months, and they did. Titus the Roman general did. And then, of course, this is the last, verse 3, this is the last days, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees. And 2 candlesticks standing before the Elohim of the earth, and if any man will hurt them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and destroys their enemies. That means they will be able to call fire down from heaven to destroy their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must be in this manner be killed. They have the power to shut heaven that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have the power over water to turn them into blood, to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. And clearly this is when the trumpets begin to sound. Okay, so we see that there is a similarity between Zechariah 2 and Revelation 11. And when you read on in Zechariah 2, you see what this is all about. Verse 4, run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls, for the multitude of men and the cattle therein. For I, saith Jehovah, will be under her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith Jehovah. For I have scattered you abroad as the 4 winds of heaven, saith Jehovah. Wait a minute. There's something else in Revelation. Actually, in Matthew. I have scattered you abroad as the four winds of heaven, saith Jehovah. Deliver yourself, O Zion, that dwells with the daughter of Babylon. Oh, wait a minute. The daughter of Babylon. This is talking about a future. This Zechariah 2 is not the same as Zechariah 1. Zechariah 1 was talking about Babylon, old Babylon. Zechariah 2 was talking about the daughter of Babylon, a future Babylon, a future persecutor of Jerusalem. Who was that? Rome. Rome, or Europe, dominated by Rome. The daughter of Babylon. For thus saith Jehovah of hosts, after the glory he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. He that touched you touched the apple of his eye. For behold, I will shake my hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to their servants. And you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for lo, I will come and dwell in the midst of you, saith Jehovah. And many nations shall be joined unto Jehovah in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of you. And you shall know that Jehovah of hosts sent me unto you, and Jehovah shall inherit Judah, the Jews, his portion in the Holy Land, and shall choose Jerusalem again. Now, when you read this, then you begin to understand Daniel 9. So he's telling all the nations, shut up, be silent, O all flesh, before Jehovah, because he is raised up out of his holy habitation in Jerusalem. So you see, folks, the destruction of the 10 toes of Daniel 2, those are the daughter of Babylon. You see, the daughter of Babylon and Babylon are not the same. So I hope this is enough to convince. If it is not, I've done my duty. I don't know how to help you.